sir, how can there be peace in Namibia when there isn't peace in South Africa right now?
There is peace in South Africa.
But there are
more peace in South Africa than elsewhere in the world.
Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now presents these stories.
This is Stuart Sender. Targeting healthcare, the anti-apartheid movement has launched a Defiance Campaign, protesting segregated and inadequate healthcare.
He must not admit people on the basis of their skin colors, but he must admit people on the basis that they need medical attention.
This is Nadja Smith, shutting off the news. How South Africa's media centers have been effective in driving news they don't like from your TV set. We'll premiere a new documentary.
It's always in a camera person's mind, or it's in a producer's mind. Can we do this? Can't we do that? How far can we push? And it's more a threat than something that is enforced daily.
This is Mweli Mzizi. In our culture segment, the political sounds of the grassroots, our cameras covered a unique cultural festival.
Now is the time for South Africa to be free.
All these stories and more this week on South Africa Now, with hosts Fana, Kekana and Carolyn Craven.
Dumelang. This week, Marcia McBroom is sitting in for Carolyn Craven, who is on assignment. And now, the news. Critics say that the healthcare system has always been one of the most malignant examples of how apartheid kills. The segregated and inadequate facilities deprive black people of decent medical care. Now, this system has been targeted with a Defiance Campaign that has already had an explosive impact, literally. Stuart Sender reports.
Healthcare for blacks is one of the most inhuman aspects of apartheid, say many who've worked in the system. While well-equipped whites-only hospitals have many empty beds, even empty wards, blacks often receive inadequate care. In conditions so overcrowded, patients are often forced to sleep two to a bed or on the floor.
The South African government always says that healthcare services are separate but equal. This is a myth. This is a myth which has led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. In the Johannesburg area alone, within 8 miles of each other, we have a black hospital and a white hospital. The black hospital has been 250% overcrowded for the last 35 years, despite consistent protests from doctors, nurses, and health professionals. The white Johannesburg hospital is 2/3 empty.
The Defiance Campaign is a direct response to these conditions by South Africa's mass democratic movement, an umbrella for the country's anti-apartheid groups. These acts of civil disobedience are winning the support of many South African doctors.
I pledge this here and now. We, the Wits Medical School, will continue to agitate, to shout, to threaten, to demonstrate, to do everything possible to bring about a situation in which the people of this country will have what is rightfully theirs, namely access to adequate health care without regard to irrelevancies such as race.
At least 800 black patients showed up at hospitals around the country where normally only whites are treated. 50 people received medical care here at Johannesburg General Hospital.
They are saying that he must not admit people on the basis of their skin colors, but he must admit people on the basis that they need medical attention.
While organizers say the beginning of the Defiance Campaign was largely successful, there were complaints about the heavy police presence at some hospitals.
One just walks around the hospital grounds here. It is very clear that it's surrounded by security staff. We have the security police here with us, accompanying us wherever we go to. And under those circumstances, they are making it impossible for black patients to even present themselves to this hospital. We are determined to ensure that this campaign continues until all health facilities are completely open.
There was also criticism of government attempts to paint the peaceful action as a violent move to disrupt South Africa's elections scheduled for early September. Here's how pro-government South African Broadcasting reported the story.
The disruptions planned by the MDM include house-to-house visits by activists to intimidate people into not voting, petrol bomb attacks on election candidates, a march on government buildings in the capital Pretoria, and the disruption of transport and hospital services.
The level of this official disinformation illustrates that these non-violent protests may be the strongest challenge yet of the South African government's willingness to tolerate change. In the weeks ahead, the mass democratic movement says the next targets are segregated schools, transportation, and housing. South Africa Now will continue to follow the story. This is Stuart Sender reporting.
There have been 2 petrol bomb attacks in...
This is Phillip Tomlinson. In the wake of the Defiance Campaign, 2 bombings in the black township of Alexandra. One at the apartment of a youth leader and the other at the Alexandra Health Center. The roof of the health center collapsed and the interior was gutted after 2 firebombs were reportedly hurled into the building. Security guards with pickaxes and crowbars managed to free nurses who were trapped inside the burning building.
As I was coming out, I looked at the kitchen. There was a flame coming and the smoke was from that flame. So I went up. I started screaming all over. And then the people from those houses, the builders, they came to help us.
It was not determined who was responsible for the bombing. Police say it was a faulty electrical circuit, but a security guard said he saw 2 white men running from the center. Minutes later, another bombing, this time at the apartment of Paul Mashatile, president of the Alexandra Youth Congress, who was awakened by the sound of his bedroom window breaking and the smell of smoke. An empty fuel can was found outside the front door. It was turned over to police, who said they would investigate. Police tell South Africa Now they are investigating, but so far no one has been apprehended.
Church organizations are a major target of repression in South Africa. The recent spraying of poison gas at a South African Council of Churches meeting is only the latest example. Nadja Smith reports on what appears to be a sophisticated pattern of assault on the anti-apartheid movement.
As political organizations in South Africa have been banned and their leaders jailed and restricted, church leaders like Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu have come to represent the anti-apartheid movement to the world, but at home they are constantly under attack. Last year, Khotso House, the headquarters of the South African Council of Churches, was destroyed by a bomb.
This is foul.
And this past June, there were 3 attacks. First, the Reverend Frank Kekana, the head of the Council of Churches, nearly died after his luggage was allegedly laced with a toxic chemical found in nerve gas and insecticides.
I had acute respiratory problems and lost consciousness at one stage.
Also in June, a poison gas was sprayed inside Regina Mundi, a Soweto church known as the Center for Anti-Apartheid Activity in the Black Township, one day before the memorial of the June 1976 uprising. And now another apparent attack, again with poison, again in a church. This time at the annual conference of the South African Council of Churches, as 40 people collapsed after exposure to a cyanide-based substance. Frank Kekana charges that the South African government is behind these attacks.
Church leaders say that if these attacks are intended to chill anti-apartheid activism, they have actually had an opposite effect. They point to the newly launched Defiance Campaign as some of the most widespread civil disobedience to date.
This week in our news update, in what is being called the worst violation so far of the Angolan ceasefire, UNITA rebels have reportedly shot down a military transport plane, killing 42 people. The government blames the CIA-backed UNITA movement, which is known to have Stinger missiles supplied by the US. A commission has now been set up to verify the ceasefire between government and UNITA forces. Also, Morocco is being mentioned as a possible retreat for UNITA's leader Jonas Savimbi, while discussions continue about a possible role for UNITA in a new Angolan government. And in Mozambique, a Congress of the governing Frelimo party has agreed to negotiations with Renamo, the so-called Mozambique National Resistance, which has been carrying on a brutal guerrilla war that has cost more than 100,000 lives. Mozambique's President Joaquim Chissano also says that while the South African government is no longer backing the rebels, certain unnamed elements in South Africa continue to support them. Each week, we present Namibia Watch, a look at the progress of UN Resolution 435 and the transition to independence in Africa's last colony. Here with this week's report is Joseph Dicho.
Moro, as the UN independence process continues in Namibia, 70% of the country's eligible voters are registered for elections which are still scheduled for November. But there are some Namibians who won't be voting, residents of Walvis Bay, Namibia's only deepwater port, which will remain under South African control. Indeed, for these black Namibians, there will be no independence. They live in Walvis Bay, still owned by South Africa, a legacy of British rule. As Namibia's only deepwater port, Walvis Bay carries great strategic significance. South African President P.W. Botha has said that as long as Britain controls the Falkland Islands, Walvis Bay will be part of the Republic of South Africa. With South African military planning to build a permanent base there, it is clear that Pretoria has no plans to relinquish it. Attorney Gay McDougall monitors the UN independence plan.
Now what that means is that all imports and exports from Namibia will either have to go out of Walvis Bay, which the South Africans will still control after independence, or by rail through South Africa proper. It makes Namibia a coastal state, in essence, landlocked and totally captive, a hostage to South Africa economically.
But ironically, the power supply for Walvis Bay will be controlled by a new Namibian government, a possible bargaining point with South Africa. The townships are SWAPO strongholds and their residents are determined to play a role in the upcoming elections in the new Namibia. Walvis Bay SWAPO branch secretary Wilfred Angula.
The people here are Namibians, and that is blood and body, and you can't separate those things.
You're watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
South Africa Now began as a response to media censorship in South Africa. Since then, there has been a virtual blackout of television coverage in this country. Our report this week looks at how that happened. We'll show you an excerpt from a powerful Irish documentary called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, produced by Mary Raftery. But first, some background on the effects of censorship, a subject that was analyzed in depth by the Canadian government and reported by the McNeil Lehrer News Hour.
The report found that following the press restrictions, the three major U.S. networks carried far fewer items about South Africa in their evening newscasts. According to the report, Pretoria has been largely successful in removing scenes of poverty, violence, and human rights violations from the television newscasts of the Western world.
The 11th Hour, a New York public television show, featured a discussion on the subject with leading journalists, including Kenneth Walker, an ex-Nightline correspondent, and Richard Cohen, formerly with CBS News.
While news executives wring their hands and love to talk and to lament about the emergency rule restrictions in South Africa, I think their dirty little secret is that they've lost interest in the story. And I think they've lost interest in the story because the pictures are gone.
In places where there's this kind of repression, Eastern Bloc countries, communist countries, it's a badge of honor for American journalists to press the margins, to test the limits, to get the story out. Well, you don't have that kind of attitude, by and large. There are some notable exceptions in South Africa, and I think that has a lot more to do with indifference than fear.
We also spoke with one of South Africa's most prominent journalists, Alistair Sparks.
The story remained a good story, but it was a story that required explanation. And it seems to me that given your high highly competitive private enterprise television system, everything depends on the dramatic picture. And if you don't have that dramatic picture, you don't get on the newscast.
But the story itself starts here, inside South Africa, where Irish television took its camera.
I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're not allowed to be here. And that's that.
Yes, freedom of the press, and the press knows that I stand for freedom of the press. But what I don't stand for, I stand for a responsible press.
But some journalists continue to push the law as far as they can and have suffered the consequences. Brian Tilley, a South African cameraman, persists in attempting to show the reality of apartheid in his country. In 1985, during protests in Mamelodi Township near Pretoria, he was shot in the leg by the police.
It's very difficult to know how the law is going to be enforced. It's like a blanket ban on everything, which they don't enforce the whole time, but it's withheld as a threat. And it's always in a camera person's mind, or it's in a producer's mind. Can we do this? Can't we do that? How far can we push? And it's more a threat than something that is enforced daily. So in that way, people are forced to censor themselves. Sometimes I think we're over the edge, we're right over the edge, without necessarily knowing it.
The regulations themselves cover a huge area. They cover almost everything: security force action, conditions in detention, boycotts, banned organizations, restricted organizations, a whole range of areas. But in fact, what we can or cannot do at any time is determined by what that week or that month most offends the minister.
While journalists working for alternative papers attempt to report on issues as effectively as they can, they do not see that same commitment from the international media.
Well, that's really the area where it's been most effective, tragically. They've succeeded in removing the story from the television screens and front pages of the newspapers and networks around the world.
It's a clampdown designed to...
A clear measure of success for the South African government is that we simply do not see pictures like these anymore. When an attempt was made by the foreign press to reflect the reality of conflict in the country 2 years ago, the government reacted swiftly and effectively.
And then to stamp out black unrest. The authorities aren't pulling any punches. This was the most violent campus unrest since the imposition of the state of emergency last June. We're able to...
Michael Burke, then the BBC's South Africa correspondent, was expelled from the country after he reported on these riots in Cape Town in April 1987. Also expelled with him was the ITN correspondent Peter Sharp.
I think it boiled down to the daily paper in Cape Town running 2-paragraph story on the front page saying BBC and ITN has shown pictures of violence in South Africa for the first time since emergency regulations were passed. And somebody senior, we think probably PW Botha, seeing that and just going, throw them out.
The man who holds the pen holds the gun, effectively. And propaganda and manipulation of the media is an extremely useful tool of trade if you're trying to make things very difficult for the government.
If you remember how it was before the emergency in '85, every single night Western television was completely dominated by images of incredible state violence, and the level of resistance that was being portrayed gave everybody a completely different idea of the kind of feel of South African society. Now, the fact that those images have totally disappeared off the screen, I think the kind of bland coverage that we have now gives a very, very poor picture of what is going on. The media has pretty much caved in, or at least the Western media has really caved into the censorship in what I think is a very, very scandalous manner, means that the South African government have had their way. They've been extremely, extremely successful.
The fact is that we are banned from reporting certain things. It's our policy that we should live within the letter of the law. We know that were we to try to test the South Africans too much on this, that they would have immediate recourse to us by kicking out our correspondent.
Take away the pictures, you take away the impact. it falls down the agenda and reduces the coverage. I mean, if that is the objective, as a short-term objective, it has been immensely successful.
The South African embassy in London has been under siege from a continuous anti-apartheid picket for the past 3 years. But since the imposition of censorship, they are now much happier with the world's portrayal of their country.
On the whole, I am, yes. I think there's been almost a sea change in the coverage we are receiving. And I think there are serious and good journalists writing today who are getting beneath the surface, beneath the foam, as it were, and writing some really rather remarkable pieces on what is happening in South Africa. We're not scared of criticism. We are, shall I say, unhappy about unreasonable criticism.
I think the key issue is to make the international community completely blank and blind to the realities of the situation we are facing, so that they can manipulate the thinking of people outside. And when they don't see the pictures they used to see, they also think there is nothing happening. And they actually fall straight into the trap of what this system wants to. It's to manipulate people's thinking, their ideas and conception of what is happening in South Africa.
In the weeks ahead, we will feature another excerpt from this Irish documentary, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. The topic, the alternative media's response to press censorship inside South Africa.
You're watching South Africa Now. Coming up next, our culture segment, featuring the best music, film, drama, and artistic expression from Southern Africa.
I'm Phillip Tomlinson. Each week, we present cultural reports on increasingly well-known South African artists. This week, something different. A rare look at the grassroots culture of South Africa's workers who performed at the Congress of that country's most powerful trade union, COSATU. Mweli Mzizi has the report.
After the meetings and debates ended, at the biannual Congress of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the crowds gathered to enjoy a showcase of some of South Africa's most popular grassroots performers.
Your freedom, the majority of South Africa. Yes, your freedom. Tina sifuno wela lokula, sifuno gamale mo, sifuno dofase.
Culture is a very important part of our almost daily activity as COSATU, because culture is an important weapon of our struggle. If you had to go into the hall and look at the plays or look at the songs or look at the poetry, it's all are symbols and a reflection of the resistance of our people to apartheid, to commercialized culture.
Mbuli, called the People's Poet, has been detained repeatedly by the government for his outspoken criticism of apartheid. He was recently released from prison, where he spent several months in solitary confinement.
Isolated and thinking, alone, all alone, dreaming and suffered nightmares, alone, all alone. 176 days, 176 nights in solitary confinement, alone, all alone, alone in a solitary cell, alone, alone in a solitary corner, alone, alone in solitary confusion, alone, alone in a solitary conversation, alone, yes, alone in solitary combat against solitary confinement, alone. All alone.
From the emotional appeal of Mbuli's poetry to the sounds of the jazz pioneers, the Congress encompassed an array of performers.
people of South Africa.
Yet another form of expression is seen here on People's TV, presenting the type of news that people won't see on government-controlled television.
Peace in South Africa depends on democratic rights for all, the unveiling of organizations.
What we are promoting, in fact, is an alternative culture, a culture of the people, where it's not exploitative, it's not abusing of women, for example. It reflects the rich history of our people and the rich currents of resistance at this point in time.
Creative ways. The Congress provided a chance for labor organizations inside South Africa to meet and discuss the problems facing their country. But equally important was the reaffirmation and expression of a growing people's culture.
Thank you for watching South Africa Now. We are now on the air in 50 cities across the United States, as well as the Caribbean and a number of African countries. For a free resource guide on the issues we cover, or to obtain a transcript, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to South Africa Now, P.O. Box 1907, Canal Street Station, New York, New York 10013. Transcripts are $3. Ask for show N102. We also welcome your comments. South Africa Now is produced by Global Vision on a non-profit basis in association with the Africa Fund. Next week, we'll take a look at Lavai Camp, a squatters camp in South Africa that had been under the threat of forced removal for years. With the help of its sister city, St. Paul, Minnesota, the residents of Lavai Camp will now be able to stay. We'll have that story for you. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of everyone at South Africa Now, I'm Fana Kekana. We'll see you next week.